Before the world even stirs, before the pings of your phone, the headlines, the expectations, the demands, there is a space, a sacred space, a sliver of silence that belongs only to you. It's the briefest moment, often overlooked, often rushed through. But in that space, before you've slipped on yesterday's thoughts or today's pressure, lies one of the most powerful opportunities you'll ever get. A chance to choose your inner state before the outer world chooses it for you. Most people miss this moment entirely. They wake up and instantly reach for their phones. Their minds flood with emails, unfinished tasks, and worries they didn't resolve the day before. It's as if the body is awake, but the spirit is still trapped somewhere, tangled in tension, pulled backward into regret, or flung forward into anxiety. But in the teachings of Buddhism, morning is not just a routine. It is a doorway, a transition space between the unconscious world of sleep and the conscious reality of our day. And what we plant in this liminal space grows, quietly, deeply, and persistently. The Buddha once said, "What you think, you become. What you feel, you attract. What you imagine, you create." And if that's true, then the thoughts you nurture in the morning are not small or trivial. They are the seeds of your becoming. Your morning is your mind's most fertile soil. That's why the first words you whisper to yourself matter, not the words of fear, judgment, or comparison, but the ones rooted in awareness, in truth, in presence. This moment, before the day unravels, is a choice. And that choice begins with what you tell yourself. If you're watching this now, it's not by accident. Something within you is awakening, something deeper than the endless scroll or the shallow race to do more and be more. You're not just looking for productivity. You're looking for peace. You're looking for clarity, maybe even freedom. And the good news is you don't need to chase it. You don't need to buy it. You don't need to earn it. You only need to remember it, because peace isn't something out there. It's something in here within you waiting to be accessed again. Imagine this: you wake up tomorrow, not to an alarm, not to urgency, but to intention. You pause. You sit up slowly, letting your body settle. You place your feet gently on the ground, feeling the earth beneath you. You feel the coolness of the air on your skin. Your chest rises and falls with your breath. You place your hand over your heart, and instead of rushing to fix, check, worry, or do, you listen. You listen to your breath, to your heartbeat, to the simple truth that you're here, you're alive. And in this very breath, this one precious breath, you are enough. This is the entry point. This is not about ignoring your responsibilities or pretending life is always calm. It's about reclaiming your inner world before the outer one floods in. It's about remembering that before you're a worker, a parent, a partner, or a task list, you are a soul, a presence, a witness. You see, most of our suffering doesn't come from what's actually happening. It comes from the mind racing ahead, into fear, into assumption, into what if, or from dragging behind, into shame, into memory, into I should have. But in Buddhism, the present moment is where suffering ends. Here, now, this breath. That's where your power lives. So why don't we start there? Why don't we begin the day not by reacting, but by remembering? Remembering that you're not broken. You're not behind. You're not defined by your productivity. You are simply here, and that is enough. Even the Dalai Lama said, "Every day think as you wake up, today I am fortunate to be alive. I have a precious human life. I am not going to waste it." Not wasting it doesn't mean rushing to do more. It means waking up to what already is. The breath in your lungs, the light filtering through your window, the silence before noise, the peace that already lives in you, quiet, unshaken, and whole. That's why this morning practice, this mindful return, is not a luxury. It's not a spiritual add-on. It's your foundation. And from that foundation, you build your day. From that center, you respond, not react. From that stillness you act, not scramble. From that presence you remember, you are not your worries, your inbox, or your past. You are the awareness behind it all. And this awareness, it doesn't yell. It doesn't beg for attention. It waits silently, patiently, until you return to it. So tomorrow morning, try something simple. Before the world reaches for you, reach for yourself. Not the version of you that performs, not the version of you that worries, but the version of you that simply is. And when that awareness awakens, even for just a few breaths, you begin the day not as a slave to chaos, but as a student of presence. The kind of presence that shifts your energy. And energy, as you'll soon see, shapes your reality. Because when you start the day from stillness, when you rise with intention instead of reaction, when your first voice is a voice of peace, everything begins to change. The question is, what will you choose to tell yourself when the world is still quiet enough to hear it? And with that, we begin with the first truth. A truth so simple, yet so transformative, it has the power to change the entire trajectory of your day. Let's begin right where you are. Have you ever paused for a moment, truly paused and whispered to yourself, I am here, I am alive, this moment is enough? Not as a poetic phrase, not as something to post online, but as a lived, present moment experience. Most people live as if life is a rehearsal. They rush through mornings, complain through afternoons, and collapse into bed, never truly tasting the hours that passed. But Zen Buddhism teaches us something radically simple. This moment is all you ever truly have, and when you are fully present in it, you already have enough. You see, our suffering often begins the moment we abandon the now. We become entangled in what could have been, or what might come. We measure today's worth by yesterday's failures or tomorrow's fears. But pause. Right now, take a deep breath. Can you feel your lungs expand? Can you sense the beat of your heart without doing anything at all? That's life. That's the miracle. Not the house you'll buy next year. Not the approval you're chasing. Not the number of followers or dollars, just this breath, this heartbeat, this awareness. In the Zen tradition, there is a practice called shikantaza. It means just sitting. Not meditating to get calmer, not sitting to reach enlightenment, but simply being. It is the practice of no practice. It's where the monk sits down not to escape life, but to become intimately intimate with it. No past, no future, no grasping, just this moment, as it is. Now imagine if we lived our lives this way. You're having tea, not checking your phone, not worrying about emails, just feeling the warmth of the cup, hearing the soft sound of the steam. You're walking, not lost in thought, but aware of each foot touching the earth, feeling the breeze move through your fingers like silk. Suddenly, life becomes less about chasing happiness and more about noticing it. And here's the Zen twist. When you truly notice, you don't need more, because this moment is complete, and so are you. There's a famous Zen saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The chores don't change. The world doesn't magically glow, but your presence changes everything. When you are here, when you are alive, when you recognize that this moment is enough, you no longer fight life, you dance with it. And yes, there will be pain. There will be loss. But even sorrow becomes bearable when you meet it in the present, without resistance, without stories, without judgment. In this space, you discover that peace isn't the absence of difficulty. It's the presence of full awareness, right in the heart of the difficulty. So the next time anxiety creeps in, the next time your mind rushes ahead or replays something you regret, pause, say it gently to yourself, I am here, I am alive. This moment is enough. And in that one breath of awareness, you may find more freedom than a lifetime of chasing ever brought you. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a peaceful place? perhaps sitting quietly on your porch, enjoying the evening breeze, and suddenly, a single word from someone, a look, or a phone notification shattered your inner calm. That's the moment when we give away our power. In this chapter, we explore a fundamental truth that lies at the heart of Zen Buddhism and countless teachings from the Buddha himself. No external condition can rob you of peace unless you hand it over willingly. You see, most of us live in reaction mode. We hear bad news, we get upset. Someone criticizes us, we feel hurt. Plans don't go our way, we spiral into anxiety. But peace is not about controlling the external world. That's impossible. Peace is about choosing your internal response to it. There's an old Zen parable about a monk who was insulted by a traveler. The monk simply smiled. The traveler, confused and irritated, asked, "Why didn't you react when I insulted you?" The monk replied gently, "If someone offers you a gift, and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" Just like that, the monk kept his peace by not accepting the gift of insult. He refused to be disturbed, not because he was unaware or cold, but because he was anchored in his own awareness. So how do we cultivate that? It starts with inner responsibility. We must stop blaming the world for our emotional turmoil. The weather didn't ruin our day. The rude driver didn't destroy our mood. The traffic jam didn't make us angry. We allowed those things to dictate our state. The Buddha often reminded his disciples, just as a solid rock is not shaken by the storm, the wise are not moved by praise or blame. This teaching isn't a poetic ideal, it's a practice. And the practice begins with observation. Whenever something stirs your anger, jealousy, or anxiety, pause. Ask yourself, what story am I telling myself right now? Am I reacting out of habit? Am I giving away my peace just to be right? Here's something radical to consider. Nothing disturbs you. You disturb yourself about things. A situation is neutral until your mind labels it good or bad, fair or unfair, acceptable or unacceptable. That labeling happens in a flash, but it can be observed, interrupted, and gently transformed. Let's take a real-life example. Imagine you're in a long line at the bank. It's hot. You're tired. Someone cuts in front of you. Instantly, your blood boils. But what if, just for a moment, you watched that reaction arise like a cloud drifting in the sky? What if you chose not to follow the story your ego is shouting? They disrespected me. And instead just breathed. You might notice that the anger, like all emotions, peaks, then fades. And there you are again, back in peace. Of course, this doesn't mean being passive or never standing up for yourself. It means choosing your battles from a place of clarity, not reactivity. Zen masters train themselves to remain centered amidst chaos. They don't do this by becoming emotionally numb. They do it by deeply understanding that suffering comes not from the event, but from the meaning we attach to it. That's why meditation is so powerful. It's not just about sitting quietly. It's about practicing, over and over again, the art of returning to stillness, returning to breath, returning to peace no matter what storms are outside. So here's a simple mantra you can use when life tries to shake your inner world. This cannot disturb me unless I allow it. Say it gently but firmly. Use it when you're driving in traffic. Use it when someone pushes your buttons. Use it when your mind starts spinning with worry. Because the truth is, peace isn't something to be found. It's something to be protected. It's always within you, quietly waiting. The question is, will you guard it or give it away? Let's carry that insight forward as we move into the next chapter, where we explore the hidden strength behind accepting life as it is, without trying to control it. I will treat myself with kindness, not judgment. There is a quiet kind of cruelty that many of us carry inside, and it's not from the world outside. It's the harsh voice within. That inner critic who tells you you're not good enough. That whispers you should have done better. That replays your mistakes like an endless tape, never letting you forget, never letting you rest. But Buddhist wisdom teaches something radically different. It says, you are already whole. It says, you don't need to punish yourself into becoming better. You need to love yourself into remembering who you are. Let me ask you something gently. Have you ever spoken to yourself in ways you would never speak to a friend? If your best friend came to you in pain, would you say, you're such a failure? You're too old to change. You brought this on yourself. Of course not. You'd hold their hand. You'd remind them they're still worthy. You tell them you've done your best. Let's breathe. Let's begin again. So why is it so hard to give that same compassion to yourself? In Buddhist psychology, this self-judgment is rooted in delusion, the mistaken belief that we are separate, broken, or somehow unacceptable. But the Buddha didn't teach perfection. He taught liberation. And that liberation starts the moment you stop fighting yourself. There's a beautiful Zen phrase, the way out is through the softening. Not through more discipline, not through more shame, but through softening the tight places in your heart. When we meditate, what are we really doing? We're not fixing ourselves. We're learning to sit with what is the joy, the sorrow, the confusion without turning away or attacking it. We're learning the sacred art of non-judgmental presence. And something amazing happens when we do. The moment we stop judging ourselves is the moment healing begins. The moment we offer kindness instead of criticism, growth flows naturally. Here's a simple practice I often recommend to older students who have lived through years of self-blame. Each morning before you get out of bed, place your hand gently over your heart and say, "Good morning, my dear. I see you. I love you. Let's do our best today, and if it's not perfect, that's okay." It might feel awkward at first. You might even roll your eyes, but keep doing it. Day by day, you are rewiring your nervous system to respond to struggle with gentleness, not judgment. And when you fall short, because you will, as we all do, remember this. The Buddha never said, "You must not fall." He simply said, "When you fall, get up gently and keep walking." So stop scolding yourself for what you didn't know. Stop dragging around the weight of past decisions like chains. Your suffering does not make you unworthy. Your mistakes do not define you. Only one thing defines you now: your intention to live this moment with love. So from today forward, let this be your vow. I will treat myself with kindness, not judgment. Because that's not weakness. That is the beginning of real strength. There comes a moment in every seeker's journey when they stop looking outward and begin to turn inward. It may come in the quiet of a sleepless night. It may arise in the stillness after loss. Or perhaps like a gentle whisper behind the noise of daily living, it simply arrives with the realization that the answers, the strength, the peace we've longed for were never outside us. This is the heart of Chapter 5. Everything I need is already within me. In Buddhist teachings, the concept of Buddha nature reflects this very truth. The Buddha nature is not something we acquire through effort, nor is it gifted to us by the world. It is our true essence. It means that deep within us, regardless of our age, status, or past mistakes, lies an unshakable purity, a reservoir of wisdom, compassion, and calm. So why do we spend most of our lives chasing after things outside ourselves? Because we've been conditioned to believe that fulfillment lives in achievement, that happiness is found in relationships, that peace is something to be attained when the chaos finally ends. But what if we paused right now and realized that we carry inside us the very thing we seek? Let me tell you a story. There was an old Zen monk who lived on the edge of a forest. One day, a traveler came to visit him, exhausted and heartbroken after losing everything: his fortune, his family, even his reputation. "Master," the traveler asked, How do I begin again when I have nothing left? The monk said nothing. Instead, he poured tea for his guest. But rather than stopping when the cup was full, he kept pouring until the tea spilled over the rim and flooded the table. "Why are you doing this?" the man exclaimed. The monk looked at him and gently said, "You are like this cup, so full of noise, of seeking, of stories about who you should be. Only when you empty yourself can you discover that everything you need is already within you." That story isn't about tea. It's about the way we clutter our minds with self-doubt, shame, or the desperate need for approval. It's about forgetting that we already possess resilience, clarity, and calm within us, but we drown it out by believing we must earn it from the outside. Every time you take a mindful breath, you reconnect with that inner source. Every time you observe your thoughts without judgment, you are listening to your inner wisdom. And every time you show yourself compassion, even in your moments of struggle, you affirm, "I am already enough. I don't need to become anyone else. I just need to remember who I truly am." Think about it. The tree does not ask the sky to give it roots. The river does not beg the mountain for flow. They simply exist in alignment with their nature. And so must we. So the next time life feels heavy or you feel like something is missing, sit in silence and place your hand over your heart. Say it out loud. "Everything I need is already within me." And say it again and again until it stops sounding like a quote and starts sounding like truth, because it is. As we age, we often come to a quiet realization. Peace is not something we chase. It's something we cultivate. It doesn't come from the world aligning to our expectations. It arises when we decide deeply and intentionally to become its source. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." That word, that action, that choice, it can begin with you. In this chapter, we reflect on the powerful truth that in every interaction, every thought, and every response, we have the choice to either inflame the fire or to soothe it with our calm presence. It's easy to react. When someone snaps at you, the instinct is to snap back. When life throws frustrations your way, it's natural to let your mood mirror the chaos. But every time we meet anger with anger, we multiply suffering. And every time we meet anger with understanding, we interrupt that cycle. That interruption is peace. Today, say to yourself, "Let me be the cause of peace." Not tomorrow, not when others change, but now and regardless of what others bring. It may be as simple as choosing silence over criticism. It may be pausing before replying to a harsh comment with defensiveness. It may be offering a gentle smile to someone who's forgotten how to smile back. Or it may be speaking up, not to win an argument, but to lovingly dissolve tension. There's an old Zen parable about a monk who was insulted by a man in the market. The monk, unmoved, simply bowed and walked away. When asked later why he didn't respond, the monk smiled and said, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong? Your peace is your power, and no one can take it unless you hand it over." Being the cause of peace doesn't mean being passive or weak. It means being deeply rooted, like a mountain unmoved by the wind. It means standing firm in your inner calm, even when the world storms around you. It also means forgiveness, not for the sake of others, but for the lightness it gives your own heart. It means letting go of the old resentments that weigh you down and choosing to walk through life unburdened. Let every interaction today ask this silent question: will this bring more peace or more suffering? Then let your answer shape your action. Whether you're speaking to a stranger, a loved one, or even to yourself, remember that your words carry energy. Your silence, too, is a force. Use them wisely. Use them with care. And when the day ends, as you rest your head, may you look back with soft pride, not for achievements or status, but for the peace you nurtured, the peace you shared, the peace you became. Because sometimes the greatest service we can offer the world isn't to change it, but to not let it change us. Repeat the affirmation softly to yourself as a vow. Let me be the cause of peace today. And in that vow, you'll find your truest strength. As we come to the end of this journey through the 6 Zen affirmations, let's pause and truly feel the stillness they offer. In a world that constantly urges us to chase more, do more, prove more, these teachings gently remind us to simply be. To be here, to be enough, to be at peace. You don't need to escape to a remote monastery or live a perfect life to embody these truths. You only need to return again and again to the present moment. It's not a place outside of you. It's right here, where your breath rises and falls, where the heart beats softly in your chest, where the silence between thoughts holds more wisdom than words ever could. Peace doesn't come from achieving something out there. It grows quietly from within, nurtured by awareness, watered by compassion, and protected by mindfulness. And as you begin to live by these affirmations, I am here, I choose peace. I will treat myself with kindness. Everything I need is already within me. Let me be the cause of peace today. You become more than just a seeker of wisdom. You become a radiant source of it. Even on days when the world feels chaotic or when your old habits try to pull you back, just return to these truths. Whisper them to yourself like a gentle prayer. They are not just words. They are sacred doorways to stillness, to clarity, to a joy that no one can take away. Because the real transformation doesn't happen when you merely understand Zen. It happens when you live it. When these truths become the way you walk, breathe, respond, love, and exist. And slowly, effortlessly, you don't just find peace, you become it. If this message brought stillness to your heart or clarity to your mind, we invite you to join us on this gentle path. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom to receive more teachings that awaken the soul, calm the storms within, and help you walk through life with grace, presence, and meaning. May peace be your practice, may kindness be your compass, and may the light of Zen always guide you home.